Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Australian Roundtable podcast, being broadcasted live from Brisbane, Australia. My name's Ethan Nash from tottnews.com, and I've got a couple of co-hosts with me here in the studio. I've got Johnno.
Good to be here. Thanks for having us.
And joining us for the first time today is Lindsay.
Yes. Thank you very much for having me here.
Now, gentlemen, we've got a lot to get through today. Before I get into the rundown, I'd just like to thank everyone for tuning into the inaugural episode of the Australian Roundtable podcast and appreciate the feedback. For those that are first-time listeners, you can subscribe to us on YouTube at youtube.com/Australian Roundtable, and we will have future social media links up in the future. But gentlemen, there's a lot to get through today. There's been a big week happening in the domestic front. We're going to have some quick updates on Iraq and the expenses that are being associated with it. We're going to talk about Putin and the G20. We're also going to talk about the developments with the raids, the anti-terrorism raids, and the development of a plastic sword, which is very interesting. And then we're going to get stuck into some developments from the anti-terrorism legislation. I'm going to go through some new submissions that have been brought through during the debates. And then we're going to talk about Tony Abbott and his words about preacher hate and the relationship that it has to threatening free speech within Australia. Then we can segue into international news, and we've got a lot to talk about. The United Nations just passed Resolution 2178, which essentially is a global Patriot Act, so we'll be talking about that. We're going to be talking about Ebola and a lot of new developments that have been surrounding that, and obviously talk about colloidal silvers and information in that regards. Then we're going to be talking about the gold and silver markets and some interesting new developments that have been happening there. Lindsay's got a lot to talk about for that. We're going to give a quick update on the Hong Kong protests. Johnno's been doing some research on that, and we'll be talking more about that. Then we're going to be talking about Udo Ulfkotte and his comments on Russia today. Very interesting comments, and then we'll wrap up the show with some general discussion about what's been happening. So before we get into any of that, gentlemen, Johnno, I know you've got some new developments and some updates on the new Iraq war, Iraq 3.0, and some of the expenses it may ensue whilst doing this.
Yeah, obviously last week we spent a lot of time talking about Iraq 3.0, as you put it. And just in the last week, some more information has come to light, which I think is worth discussion. I've got an article here from USA Today, and I'll just read out a quick quote from this. Americans should be braced for a long battle against the brutal terrorist group Islamic State, who will test US resolve. And the leadership of the commander-in-chief, says Leon Panetta, who headed the CIA and the Pentagon as Al-Qaeda was weakened and Osama bin Laden killed. This is a quote from Leon Panetta. I think we're looking at a kind of 30-year war, he says, one that will have to extend beyond Islamic State to include emerging threats in Nigeria, Somalia, Yemen, Libya, and elsewhere. End quote. That's from the article from USA Today. Leon Panetta, as it said, who headed the CIA and then the Pentagon. So this ISIS threat, which nobody even knew about a few months ago, they're already conditioning us to be ready for a 30-year war. What do you think of this, Lindsay?
Yes. It's just a continuation of what's been going on since Germany and rebuilding, and it's to make money. That's what it's about.
Yeah, that's obvious. And the way that I see it is, to get us into Iraq the first time around, they had to tell us that babies were being thrown out of incubators.
Yeah, that's right.
To get us into Iraq the second time round, they had to tell us that there were weapons of mass destruction that were going to kill us. Yeah. To get us in the third time, they've told us that there are these Islamists just going around beheading people. And it's almost like they're saying to us this time, listen, don't make us think of something else next time. Can we just stay for 30 years? Don't make us go through this nonsense again. What do you reckon, Ethan?
Oh, it's unbelievable, and I think you hit the nail right on the head there. It's the same thing over and over, and we spoke briefly about this in the last episode, talking about just the continuation of lies. And they did the same things with weapons of mass destruction. They did the same things all throughout history, and now they're just saying, look, we're going to be there for 30 years because we're tired of coming up with new threats and new boogeyman and new excuses to get us over there. We want to stay there. Now, keep your mouth shut and don't try and get us back. And it's just unbelievable. And we spoke last week about Joe Hockey and saying that he wants to talk about further budget cuts for an already horrendous budget that we have that targets pretty much everyone in Australia that isn't of the elite status. He talked about having to have new budget cuts to make up for the costs of the Iraq War and to make up for the expansion of intelligence, the over $600 million that they've been giving to it. Jono, I think you've got some information about Joe about the expenses.
Yeah, well, I'll touch on that in a moment. Let me also point out that just a few days ago, it came out that our defence personnel's pay rise might be less than they were hoping for. So imagine being told, hey, you are servicemen, we could have 30 years of war. We're going to see out your career and you'll be doing rotating, missions over there. This is an article from the Fairfax Sydney Morning Herald, our, left of centre tabloid in our largest city. This is from a couple of days ago. Just days after the nation's armed forces were committed to war in Iraq, 57,000 men and women in uniform were told that they will have to give up some of their Christmas and recreational leave in order to get the pay rise of just 1.5% a year over the next 3 years. Now, that's obviously below inflation, so that's a pay cut. Yeah. So they're being told, we've got a 30-year war coming up, you're taking a pay cut in real terms, and to say thanks for all of this, we're cutting your Christmas and recreational leave. Yeah. I mean, you can say that people voluntarily sign up to the military in Australia and maybe you shouldn't be sympathetic to that. Look, I understand that argument. But oftentimes their families don't have any say in it. And to cop this triple whammy, I mean, I do feel for the servicemen who just copped this news.
Yes, I agree entirely. It's almost as if they're saying, well, you're going over and having fun, so we're going to charge you for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely unbelievable, and it's just more of the madness that's been emerging from this. It's just a never-ending cycle. As I said last week, it's warfare on the psyche of the public. It's just unbelievable, Jono.
It is, and we know that if you're a government and you want to introduce a new tax, firstly, you don't call it a tax, you call it a levy. And secondly, you don't just announce it. You let it get into the public consciousness with leaks. Don't deny anything for a week or two and then say, hey, we're bringing in a new levy. And just in the last few days here in Australia, there's been media reports of a new levy being, put onto the taxpayer to pay for this mission in Iraq. Of course, it's a mission in Iraq. It's not a war. Yeah. And it's going to be a levy, not a tax. And what's this going to be to pay for? Well, in theory, they're going to try and argue that it's a levy to pay for this war to keep us free. So I'm just waiting for Tony Abbott to front the media and talk about a new freedom tax because I think it's coming. Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah. No, it's got to be. Anyway, we've had this slug periodically. I think we've been referring back. They were trying to do this in East Timor. I don't know whether it happened. They were going to put it on our Medicare levy. I think it's just an extenuation of that.
Yeah, no, it's troubling stuff, and I definitely don't doubt with the way that things have been going that they'll just come out and say, look, you need a freedom tax now where you're going to be taxed for us to keep you free, and it's just absolute madness. It's 1984 in the flesh.
And as you know, with these things, they do focus groups before they announce it, and if the focus groups look too negative, if the internal polling looks too negative about this introduction, then they'll just use the media to scare us into accepting it. So I'm almost look, if you're a listener out there and you've been invited to a polling group session and they ask you, would you support a freedom tax? Just say yes, because if you say no, if too many people say no, they'll just bombard us with 2 more weeks of propaganda until the masses support it. So do us all a favour, say you can't wait to pay a freedom tax, save us 2 more weeks of nonsense. Now that was our quick update on Iraq. I also want to give a quick update on the raids. Now, we mentioned last week how here in Australia we've been subjected to all of this propaganda to do with ISIS and all of this nonsense. Now, on September 18, we had those massive terror raids across Sydney and Brisbane where something like 600 or 800 officers, including AFP officers, raided dozens of houses. They charged, I think maybe one person got charged in the end because he had 3 bullets from a hunting trip. The whole thing was a complete psyop, and that was clear from the start. To people like us and to many of our listeners, I'm sure. To other people, not so clear. Hopefully, in the last few days, it's become more clear because just a few days ago, it was reported in the mainstream press that sword that was confiscated from somebody's house? Because there were images all over our media, ABC and the commercial media, of this sword with Islamic writing was confiscated. It looked very scary. It was bagged and confiscated. Turns out the sword was plastic. And the writing that was on it was apparently Shia script or a Shia verse from their religious texts or whatever. Of course, ISIS is supposed to be Sunni. Now, there's two big problems here. Firstly, that the media would report this as being a scary sword, right? But secondly, why the hell are the police bagging a plastic sword in the first place? What is going on?
Yeah. Terrifying. Yeah. Oh man, terrifying. They're pulling out they're bagging plastic swords on the news. ISIS are around every corner with their plastic swords. It's just. I think they were doing it. You know, they were pushing the sword in our face, you know what I mean, because it relates to the fear of being beheaded and whatnot. Are we supposed to be afraid of getting beheaded with plastic swords now? I mean, come on. Come on.
In fairness, though, if you watch any of those so-called ISIS beheading videos, they're all plastic swords too.
There's no blame there.
Maybe they actually are protecting us from the plastic sword beheading. So, look, that's the update on the raids, the terror raids that we discussed last week. One more topic I want to give a quick update on is Putin and the G20 now. We haven't had much chance to chat about this last week, and hopefully we'll get a chance either next week or the week after to discuss the whole Putin, Ukraine issue that is, a big part of geopolitics today. But for the viewers who aren't from Australia, who weren't paying attention at the time, following the MH370s, was it the 17 or the 370? The one that was shot down supposedly by the separatists. Our media was just gazumped with all of this comprehensive coverage, just completely demonising Vladimir Putin and saying, don't let him come to G20. There was an opinion poll that found that the majority of people didn't want Putin to be allowed to come to the G20, supposedly because he was responsible for the plane going down. And it was clear he was always going to come to G20. He wasn't going to be barred from it because of this incident, but our media carried on for weeks saying, we won't be allowed, or Australians won't let him here. Of course, now that we're getting closer to G20, they've announced, yes, Putin is coming, but we're going to give him very stern words. Our apology, we're going to sit him down, and what a load of nonsense. The media's finally come around and admitted Putin was always coming. Come on.
Yeah, I think it was just used as a ploy to demonise Russia and to get into the subconscious of the people to demonise Putin as a villain. I wrote an article on my website, tottnews.com, about Australia's unjustified reaction from the media and the political establishment to the MH17 incident and how they have been demonising Russia. And I think it ties in very well to what we spoke about last week about a potential third war or, an escalating conflict where Russia is drawn in. If that was to potentially happen, theoretically, the public would already perceive Putin in a bad light, which is the perfect catalyst for them to drive up the propaganda of him being the enemy. So it was clear from the start that Putin was always going to be here, and the media just ran with it. And it's just all a part of the big game of bombardment of this rubbish. What do you think, Lindsay?
Yeah, demonise him by any means possible. Oh, they do that all the time anyway. So.
Well, that's my quick update on those three topics, but we need to press on with the domestic stuff. Now, I know, Ethan, you gave a really good presentation last week on the laws that have been passed in the last couple of weeks following all of this scary propaganda. You've got more information for us today, I understand.
Yes, this is relating to the second legislative bill that I briefly touched on last week. I spoke on the first and the second and the third bill, this triple threat of doom, so you would say, that's eroding our freedoms. Obviously, the first anti-terror legislation had passed the House of Representatives, and I went through that. And now, on the 24th of September, the second legislation, which is the amendment to the Foreign Fighters Bill, the anti-terrorism law, was introduced, which, as I briefly touched on last week, expands House government's preventative detention and control order laws. They were set to expire next year, but they're going to introduce them. Expand them, sorry. And now it introduced the offence of advocating terrorism, which has a maximum penalty of 5 years if you're found, convicted of that. It broadens the scope for how control orders can be obtained and expands them to prevent Australians heading to countries classified as conflict zones. It also downgrades the justification for these orders from belief to suspicion, makes it easier for these orders to be obtained, and has draconian type of effects, such as 12-hour curfews that are justified just on the basis of suspicion. But now there's been new submissions to the Senate during the debate, which expands these powers even further, which includes the ability through search warrant provisions to secretly search a suspect's home, their neighbour's home, and search through their stuff, and they don't have to tell the current person that they did it for 6 months or longer now. So this is a concerning thing because previously the Crime Act requires a person to be given a copy of a warrant and to allow the person to observe the search in the flesh. And now these suggested expansions to the debate are saying that you'll be allowed to search their house while they're not home, without them even knowing, and you don't have to tell them for 6 months. And you can also search their neighbour's house, who probably isn't even related to it. It also any authorised disclosures about such activities can land journalists in prison for 2 years. That's on top of that's in relation to the potential 10-year sentence that journalists and whistleblowers can get from the first legislation for exposing special intelligence operations. So this new developments, it just expands this wide scope of draconian, just draconian nightmare that's coming through with this triple threat of anti-terrorism legislation, which is, it really is attacking free speech and is trying to demonise it. But we will get into that. But, what do you think about this, Lindsay?
Oh, well, it's a concern to me. I don't know where they get the power from. How can they possibly do something which the Queen herself, which they supposedly ministers of the Crown, how the Crown can't do it, the Queen can't do it. How do they do this to us? That's what always amazes me. They're doing things they haven't got the power to do, but they'll do it anyway because they got the guns. That's what worries me.
Yeah, and it's just unjust laws. And Martin Luther King had a famous quote, and whether you believe it or not, I think the message of it resonates well, is that everything that Hitler did in Nazi Germany was legal. And through the passing of unjust laws and whatnot, and whether you believe that or not, whether you want to debate history or whatnot, I think the premise of the quote is accurate, that we can't let these unjust laws get through, and we need to do everything. The first bill's already passed, and now the second bill is absolutely terrifying. What do you think, Johnno?
Well, I'm thinking of getting a shirt printed that says that they took away all my civil liberties, just like in Stasi Germany, and all I got were these fake ISIS beheadings. because at least in Germany they got that big Reichstag fire, and then following this big fire, this big commotion, then they took away all their civil liberties. That's what it took to take away the Germans. What have they had to do to take away our civil liberties? A few front page newspapers with guys wearing big black bags over their head, holding fake plastic knives, and that all they had to do was bombard the people with this nonsense, and people just willingly give up their civil liberties.
Yeah, exactly.
Unbelievable.
Yeah,
It really is. It's unbelievable, Lindsay. That's out and about in the weekend. I've seen protesters wearing tape over their mouth saying, "Are we there yet?" in reference to, the erosion of their free speech is going to be gone soon, and it's just increasing every day. And, protesters wearing, "Are we there yet?" taping their mouth, gagging themselves to protest, because that's what it is. We're losing, we're completely losing everything. Every time something happened, I'd always refer to the United States. This happened in the United States. This happened in the United States. This is coming here. This can come here. And now we're just reaching a level that's just unprecedented territory with the erosion of our rights. And, soon people are going to be referring to what happened in Australia. I've seen international media covering these laws saying, the most unprecedented crackdown. I mean, imagine if the NSA or the CIA got authorization to monitor the entire US internet legally. We already know they're doing it, but imagine if it was legally and you could go to 10 years in jail for reporting on it, and they're exempt from... It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, there are some people who would suggest that sometimes Australia and New Zealand and some of the other countries in the Five Eyes are used as like a testing ground before they enact things in other countries. And the point that I make to people in other countries, an online forum or whatever, is that if they're doing this to us, and look how easily we are rolling over. There's no intellectual resistance here. If they're doing this to us, how long until they do it to you?
Well, Port Arthur was a perfect example. That was a setup for how people are going to react when they do it to the American with the guns. they killed those 35 people. They just got away with it. No colonial inquiry, just roll on over us. And we all sat down and said, yes, give it to me. And that's what they're going to bring to the US now. They're going to do the same thing. Anyway.
And you know what gets me about that, Lindsay, is that I have met so many people, especially people above the age of 35 or 40, so people who were adults at the time of Port Arthur, and so many of them say to me, yeah, of course the official story is nonsense. Like, who would believe that?
Yeah.
But they don't do anything
about it. Yeah.
So even if you have many people who know that this is wrong, who know that it's nonsense, so long as they stay quiet or do nothing, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how blatant these psyops are.
Yeah.
So long as enough people go along with it, these things go ahead.
They just keep doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought from the very beginning that these laws are just we're just a test dummy for this, and we're also being a test dummy because here, they're starting to crack down on free speech, and that leads us into the next topic about Tony Abbott talking about trying to stop preacher hate. Now, if you tuned into episode 1, we talked about David Cameron's speech to the United Nations, talking about how anyone that questions 9/11 or the 7/7 bombings or thinks of an ideology that's different from the perceived worldview, that they are on a non-violent extremism or on the same ideology as people like ISIS or organizations that, are with ISIS, in these sort of extremist views. And now Tony Abbott has come out within the last week to say that they want to crack down on preachers of hate within the country, and that's exactly what David Cameron called it at the UN. So, what do you think about this, Johnno? What do you think about preachers of hate?
Well, here's the point. If we sit back and say, well, let them stop the preachers of hate, right? Because that sounds scary. Preachers of hate, let's stop them. They can't stop them because these people have done anything illegal. So it's not, here are people who are coming to do things that are illegal, people who have done stuff that's illegal. No, we just don't like what they're preaching.
Yeah.
And even us today doing this podcast, we could be called preachers. And if we say things that some people don't particularly like or find offensive, they might accuse us of being preachers of hate. Yeah. So if we sit by and say, let them attack the preachers of hate for Islam, well, who do you think is next?
Yep.
I mean, do people actually believe that this is the end game? It's just to stop the preachers of hate and that's it? Do people really think that?
Yeah, well, it's unbelievable from the very beginning, Lindsay. It was clear evidence that they are cracking down on anyone that questions the system, and it's just preachers of hate. You know what I mean? No, the main point to get across to people is no one's committing a crime here. It's what I mean. We're not There is racial discrimination laws for this. There are laws that stop hateful speech against other people, stop hateful speech in general. There's laws already to do this. The only reason, what I mean, if they really were cracking down on that, they'd use the laws that are already in force. This is about anyone that questions the system.
Yeah. Well, they did it to Brendan O'Connell in Western Australia. They put him in jail for 3 years for insulting a Jewish man. And he copped a beating and broke his arm, and there's a whole lot of other stuff went on with that. So there's plenty of... David Irving. They refused David Irving entrance to Australia. So they've had plenty of legislation to enable them to do whatever they wanted to do. This is overkill. That's simple as that.
Yeah, it's just rolling it out to the general public, Johnno.
You've always got to try and look at the bright side, though. And I have evidence of people like Julie Bishop and David Johnston and Tony Abbott and Bill Shorten, all of these politicians saying that ISIS are murderers, monsters, evil, a death cult. They're saying some very hateful things about ISIS. So if we ban preachers of hate, maybe we can ban half the people in Canberra. Yeah. Always look at the bright side, Lindsay.
Yeah, but they've got authority to do that in Parliament without being arrested. That's English law. Is that relevant in Australia? I don't know. Well, anyway, it allows them to do whatever they can do. Whatever.
Either way, they're going to get away with it. I don't think they have any regard for any law, and it's quite obvious the media and the political establishment are the biggest preachers of hate because they're, they're telling us who to hate. Yeah. They're not preaching hate themselves. They're manipulating us to be, and. It's just unbelievable, John. I can't believe that all of this is allowed to get through with hardly any opposition. We talked about 10 years ago, there was 10,000 people in the streets of Brisbane protesting the Iraq War. Now, it's just completely going ahead. And this is a good segue into our international speech, talking about cracking down on freedom, because just within the past week, the United Nations passed resolution 2178, which has come under major concern. While everyone's been distracted by, other things, things that don't really have much significance but are being distracted by it. They've passed this, and the concern is that this is practically a global Patriot Act. At the conclusion of the General Assembly this year, which David Cameron got up and said, preachers of hate, etc., they passed this act, and it was unanimously supported by the Security Council. And I'll just go through, for those that are unfamiliar with it, what this entails. It gives member states justification to increase surveillance and requires the members to stop domestic terrorists. So this is where the second legislative anti-terrorism law in this country comes into, because now every country is going to enact a law like this that's on the Security Council. They're going to enforce laws like this to prevent people from growing domestically at home. And the real concern about this is that I've always said there's no clear definition of terrorism. There's no definition of terrorism under international law. And I've wrote freelance papers on this talking about how Iraq was illegal, how Afghanistan was illegal, because you can't declare war on an ideology. You're declaring war on a nation to get an ideology. And but that's for another time. But there's been books that have cited 109 different definitions of terrorism. Yeah. And now, under this broad scope of terrorism, they're trying to justify that we need to stop terrorists at homes. But the text doesn't articulate why these provisions are in place to prevent travel. It's just, we've seen examples of them just cancelling passports already, and there's essentially no justification to say this, because the most concerning part is now people under this Global Patriot Act can be persecuted for their thoughts and beliefs, not their actions. And then relating back to preachers of hate and David Cameron and the second legislation that's going to prevent terrorists from travelling, preemptively detain them, give them curfews and stuff. The pieces are starting to come together if you look at this and if you study history, that this is a global move under the guise of terrorism to take away any free speech and to take away people to question the system, just like me or you, Lindsay. What do you think of this?
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you, which came first? Was it the UN passage of that UN, or was it David Cameron? Do you know which was which?
David Cameron was first, and then towards the conclusion of the Security Council meeting is when the legislation was passed. Okay. It's just concerning stuff, because I'm going to write an article on this or do a video, but the second legislation's hardly getting any press, and now, and I didn't understand why they were doing this. I thought, sure, they're going to restrict movements and everything, but now a global Patriot Act has been passed, and we've seen the atrocities that the first global Patriot Act were responsible for in the US, the Patriot Act, which increased surveillance and, the Fourth Amendment violations and whatnot. And now under this global thing, under this broad and terrorism definition, could be a real threat to us. Johnno, what do you think?
The Patriot Act. I love how they gave it that acronym. I mean, they rub it in, don't they? They treat us like morons, and some would argue that maybe
they know what they're doing.
Do you know what the name of this? Because you've looked into this obviously pretty far, Ethan. What is the actual name of this UN resolution or this new legislation you're talking about? What's the name they've given it? Is it as cheeky as the Patriot Act?
No, it's just UN Resolution 2178. It's global. It's called global terrorism or something like that. It's just generally called its term, because it's just as most UN resolutions. But the main concern was obviously to stop terrorists, and some of the stats, according to BBC, is that 60 citizens from Australia have gone over to fight in these Middle Eastern countries to join ISIS, apparently. And then 20 have returned home, and supposedly 100 people approximately are now actively working to support the movement from Australia through funding and through recruitments and whatnot. So they're using these statistics, which I don't know are real. No. You know what I mean? They're telling me it's real. Let's think of the track history of the media for a second here. But they're using, as I said, they're using this to take away free speech, and people need to recognise this now while we still have the chance.
PK22, who is an Australian YouTuber who makes some good videos about these things, he made a point the other day, and that is they want us to believe that ISIS raided a bank and just found $500 million, right? Yeah. Which is a ridiculous story, and we've joked about this before. Let's suppose, for argument's sake, that's true. Are we supposed to believe that this group, who can just find hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of vehicles, they're dependent on people in countries like Australia
So
raising a couple of grand from,
I know.
chook raffles?
No,
It's just, it does your head in, Lindsay.
Yeah, I know.
It's so blatantly, like, they don't even care anymore. They used to actually try to disguise these things or try to make the propaganda somewhat somewhat believable. Now they're just,
we're all idiots. We're all
just
can't blame them, can you?
yeah.
All this time I thought that reality TV was a big distraction for the masses. I'm starting to realise, no, there's a bigger agenda with all this reality TV. Because people start to think that crap is even close to real.
Yeah.
So when you show them videos that are blatant psyops by the CIA or MI5 or Mossad or whoever's making these fake videos, if people have been spending hours a day watching crap that's called reality, before you know it, they'll believe anything. And that's what's happening here.
Yeah, I agree.
And you think about it, suppose you bank with Westpac, for argument's sake, here in Australia. They say if you want to withdraw more than $10,000 of currency, you have to give them 24 hours notice, right?
Yeah.
That's a bank here.
Yeah.
But we're supposed to believe that these turkeys in the Middle East, wearing their balaclavas or whatever, just rocked up to a bank in Mosul and said, "Give us all your money." And the guy behind the desk at the bank said, "How many trucks have you got, mate?" Because we've got $500 million.
I know.
Anyone who believes this nonsense, there's no point trying to talk to them about this. Let them watch their television because they're never seeing things common sense. What do you think, Ethan?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. It's so unbelievable. And I think the same person you're speaking of touched on the fact that how do these supposed people that are going over to recruit, if we can't determine whether they're in Syria or Iraq or if they're in a combination of both or whether they're scattered throughout Libya and they are terrorizing the people of these countries, how are these recruiters going over there? Are they, you know what I mean? Are they just getting off the plane and, yeah, mate, right over there's the bus you get on, ISIS recruitment, it'll take you straight out to the middle of the desert where they're driving their new Toyotas. It's just like, and this is being used to bring in this legislation. And
then again, think about it. If you're a recruiter, who's going to have the easy recruitment in Australia today? The guy from the ADF saying, "Look, we've got a 30-year war coming up. We're giving you a 1.5% pay rise over 3 years. We're taking away your leave entitlements." Or the ISIS recruiter who says, "Hey, we just roll banks, $500 million every time."
Oh wow! No, it's just and speaking of just complete deception or obviously troubling sort of questions with world events, that leads us into something we were trying to get to last week, which is the Ebola Scare, should I say, Johnno, that has supposedly taking over the entire planet, and Ebola is the most serious pandemic. I know you've got some interesting. See, talking about the mainstream media has just, made my brain go. But yeah, Johnno, I know you've got some information about the Ebola incident.
Yeah, look, I wanted to spend a bit of time today talking about Ebola because we didn't get a chance last week, and this has quickly become one of the biggest events, facing us here in the West. I'll give a quick background just for our listeners who might not have been across the issue. At the moment, there's about 8,000 cases reported and about 4,000 deaths. The majority of those are in Liberia. There's been one death in US, we'll get to that in a moment, and one case in Spain. But apart from those two, it really hasn't affected countries outside of Africa the way that it has affected those African countries. The official story is that late last year, a two-year-old boy in Guinea named Emily, I think you pronounce it like that, he's considered patient zero. He died late December last year. By mid-August of this year, it had spread to Sierra Leone and Liberia. And in August of this year, those doctors from the US, Nancy Wright-Ebol and Kent Brantley, they contracted the disease in Liberia, and then they were transferred to a hospital in Atlanta. So people who supposedly had the disease were flown into the US, which at the time I was impressed to see that so many commenters on the mainstream media outlets were saying, this is ridiculous. Why would you bring back... The whole story just never made sense. A lot of people were waking up to that. Anyhow, fast forward to October 30, and so fast forward to September 30, and the CDC reported that the first case on US soil had been confirmed, like the first regular case. That was this Duncan character,
yeah,
Thomas Eric Duncan. He died on October 8 at 7:50 a.m., which coincidentally was during the middle of the blood moon. But that is another topic for another show, I suppose. Now, in the US, they're stepping up their screening at major US airports, which I saw a thing on one of the mainstream outlets from the US involves asking people, are you ill? Checking if they're coughing, but also applying like an infrared non-contact scanner to check their temperature. And that's what they're doing at the moment. It's easy to foresee that the screening will become more comprehensive than this. A couple of days ago, I'm sure some of our listeners would have seen this, on a flight, it was a US Airlines flight from Philadelphia to the Dominican Republic. A man apparently sneezed and joked, "I've got Ebola, you're all screwed." One of his co-passengers dobbed on him, and then next thing, all the passengers on the flight were told, you have to wait there, we have to get this guy escorted off. The 4 people who came and escorted him off were all in full hazmat gear. So you're sitting there and you're being told, look, we think there might be a bio threat here. You have to sit on this plane while we get guys dressed in hazmat to escort him off. I would like to think that most intelligent people would say, well, hold on a second here. Either you're completely overplaying the risk here, you know, I don't want any part of it, or there's a genuine risk to me. I'm getting off the plane.
Yeah.
What are you...
Yeah.
I mean, it was so ridiculous, but in the video footage, all of these passengers are just sitting there like compliant little geese, putting their cameras up in the sky and recording it all. I mean, Lindsay, I would like to think that if this happened to you, you'd say, up yours, boys, I'm getting off this plane.
Yeah. But we've discussed this before. Even in the airports in Australia now, if you make even an offhanded joke about anything to do with terrorism or whatever, you'll be hit with the federal police who will escort you and put you in prison. So they've got us already to the point where we're so scared to backchat any sort of authority that they're just escalating it and they're getting away with it. They know what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you have 100 or 150 people on the plane and they all say, listen, there's 150 of us and maybe 10 or 20 of you, what are they going to do? Yeah. But what they depend on is no one doing that, no one banding together. Yeah. And they can just, walk up in hazmat suits and escort people off planes.
Yeah. But it's not just on planes. That's almost a metaphor for the whole of society.
Absolutely.
There's only a handful of them anyway, and we could wipe them out in 5 minutes. But we don't.
Which is exactly why they have to control the media the way they do.
Yeah.
So anyway, I got up to how they escorted this guy on the US Airlines flight. Now I want to read out a quote this is an article from the Washington Post. Quick quote here. "We are following the direction of and strictly adhering to all Centers for Disease Control and Prevention," that's the CDC guidelines, "in place for airlines in response to the Ebola virus," the airline's statement read. This is US Airlines regarding that flight we just spoke about. "The flight was checked by officials and cleared. We apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused, but the safety of our customers and employees is our first priority." And when I read about this, I thought to myself, hold on, this was in the Dominican Republic. How did they have the hazmat suits just waiting there at the airport? And why is the American CDC, why are they getting to dictate what happens on the tarmac in a place like the Dominican Republic?
Well, if you go back, remember I can't even think of his name now. There was a fellow in Mexico, I think, and they went down and just picked him up, just picked him up over drugs. They seem to be able to do anything they want in any country they want. And that's shades of Israel too. They've threatened to do that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, we'll carry on with this little, because I'm just giving the background to this Ebola thing before we get into the bigger discussion. Where this story gets really interesting and relevant to all of us in the West is the declaration of public health emergency on October 7 by Daniel Malloy, who's the governor of Connecticut. Yeah. I'll read out a quote from that statement. This is a direct quote. "I hereby declare a public health emergency for the state, pursuant to the Connecticut General Statutes, Section 131A, for the duration of the epidemic. Specifically, in accordance with Connecticut General Statutes, Section 19A, 131B, I authorize the Commissioner of Public Health to order the isolation or quarantine under conditions prescribed by the Commissioner of Public Health of any individual or group of individuals whom the Commissioner reasonably believes to have been exposed to, infected with, or otherwise at risk of passing the Ebola virus," end quote. That was from Daniel Malloy, the governor of Connecticut, on October 7, so just a few days ago. So what he's essentially said there is, we now have the permission to apprehend anyone who we think may be at risk of Ebola. So we talk about how they've eroded our civil liberties here in Australia and they've used a terrorism threat. Well, over there, it seems as though they're using the Ebola threat to say, hey, we don't care who you think you are. All we care about is if we want to apprehend you, we'll do it. And if you can get an entire plane full of idiots to sit there on their asses while someone comes in hazmat suits and takes someone away, you better believe that if they come to your door and say, we think you might have Ebola, when all your neighbours are like, are they apprehending him? All these people have to do is say, yeah, he might have Ebola. Take him! Get rid of him. Yeah. That's how easy it is with this threat of Ebola. I'll continue the background and then we'll get into the broader discussion. Just for people who might not be aware, Connecticut is a state of about 3.5 million people in northeastern US. And it's one of the wealthier states in the US. It's like the third highest on median household income. Here's the fun part. There are no cases of Ebola in Connecticut. And that Thomas Eric Duncan character who supposedly died in Dallas, Texas. Well, Dallas, Texas is about 2,500 kilometers away from Connecticut. So this would be like somebody supposedly dying of Ebola up in northern Queensland, northern at the tip of Australia. And then a politician in Sydney saying, well, now we have to take away all your rights. We can just apprehend you because you might have Ebola. That's the situation that we find ourselves in now. That's why this Ebola story is so serious. I'll give a little bit more information. The Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, who I mentioned just before, have a site on the page on their site entitled Legal Authorities for Isolation and Quarantine. I'll read out a quote from that page. Quarantine is used to separate and restrict the movement of well persons, I'll repeat that, well persons, who may have been exposed to a communicable disease to see if they become ill. These people may have been exposed to a disease and do not know it, or they may have the disease but do not show symptoms. Quarantine can also help limit the spread of communicable disease. So what is this saying? So even by the CDC's own website definition, they're saying if we have the right to quarantine, we can quarantine you even if you have no symptoms, just in case you get ill. And the page lists which diseases this applies to. And then it says, and again I'll quote, federal isolation and quarantine are authorized by executive order of the president. The president can revise this list by executive order. End quote. So in other words, this isn't even just about Ebola. I mean, they could make up any disease they want. And right now they've already set people up with all the fear in the media. All of these clearly fake stories on CNN and ABC of people supposedly having Ebola. And they've set the scene now. All they have to do is say, we think you might be a risk because you might have a disease. We can take you away. And here's the best part. No one's going to come to your aid, right? Because you're all just as scared as each other. We've got the hazmat suits. We're marching your way. So that's the background, boys. What do you think?
Well, my concern with it is, can they give you vaccinations compulsorily? I don't think they get at the moment. They couldn't. I think from in America and the same in Australia. But will this allow them to give you vaccinations?
That's a good question. I've read reports from alternative media outlets and from YouTubers that means they can give you vaccinations. In all the research that I've done so far, I haven't found any official sources that state that. Obviously, I'm trying to stick to what they've officially said. I mean, if you just look at their website, they're officially saying we can take you away for anything. I haven't found them admit or to state on their own website that they can, inoculate you or whatever. But obviously, my expectation would be, of course, that's what they can do. Because that's where I think, and this is where I want to get into a conversation with you two about it, that's where I think this is headed, is forced vaccination.
It's forced vaccination. And then they're liable to give you the symptoms. So then suddenly they find, oh, you have got the symptoms. Because they've given you something that'll, anyway. And I think they're going to get into boggy ground here because there are an awful lot of people in America and in Australia who really don't want vaccinations under any circumstances because we just don't trust them. Well, anyway, I'll let you talk about that.
One thing that it got me is it's hard to actually, because I'm conflicted on the whole Ebola thing, whether it's a fabricated thing, whether people have been, intentionally made sick, as you've said, through some of these things to justify it, or whether if it is real or it's been intentionally allowed to be spread, which is clearly obvious. But it's one thing to relate to is it's hard to get through all this propaganda and this mainstream deception to try and these blatant fear tactics to try and actually, pin down the actual representation because it's hard when a pharmaceutical industry and a scientific community that are all bought and paid for by the same people that are pushing whatever they want through the media and through their agenda. The same people that are funded by them are the ones that are giving you the information about this when you go back to the actual original sources of it. So it's hard. And one thing I related to a friend the other day, and this is just the purpose of the relation means to it. We're talking about political ideologies and living under, communism or socialism or, socialist democracy or, democracy, or which system would be the best. And I said, it's hard because we've never lived in I personally have never lived in a country that's been under communist, or a dictatorship or, a socialist country. And all I'm reading about these ideologies is what I see in the history books written by a country that tells me that this is democracy, when it's clearly not democracy. We're not living in a democracy. We've never had a chance to live in a democracy. We're given the illusion of freedom. So I relate that deception back to the Ebola thing is, it's hard for us to even through alternative sources to get the legitimate information about this. And all the public is being, forced upon through their subconscious is this fear that Ebola is everywhere. And it's justifying, what Johnno just spoke on about, rounding anyone up. And it's just madness. And I think it is being used as similar to what the terrorism threat over here is. Ebola is, Ebola's the boogeyman over there. And it's just what happened with swine flu. Swine flu was supposed to be the most, devastating pandemic ever. Supposedly 27 people or so died. Give me a break.
And
Johnno, what do you think?
It leads you to wonder that swine flu thing, because again, that was a very comprehensive fear campaign that they had back then. I had a friend who was studying in Mexico at the time, and they ended their semester early, so she got to just spend more time traveling. But that's how serious the swine flu. We might have forgotten just how serious it was, or at least how serious they told us it was. And sometimes you wonder, was that like a test? I mean, the people who do this, the people at the very top, they're very intelligent, more intelligent than me. They work together. They're smart. They would be smart enough to do a little practice test to see how easy it is to manipulate people into the fear. And then a few years later, hey, now we've got the Big Daddy fear campaign, and it's Ebola. Now, as you guys know, I don't watch as much mainstream news, perhaps as some people do. I wasn't aware, you guys were telling me off air, that there was reporting on our 6 p.m. bulletins that Ebola, there was a suspected Ebola case in Cairns or something. Is this right?
Yeah, that's correct, There's a woman up there she got a fever. She'd been working in Africa, came back, and felt that she had a fever, and bang, they whacked the whole bit, put her in isolation, and anyway, air conditioning that's non-pressured or something, and so it wouldn't disperse throughout the rest of the hospital. We're waiting till Monday, apparently, for the final rundown to see whether she actually has got it or not. But that's just the same thing. It was just a beat up. I mean, normally, under normal circumstances, you say, oh, a woman's got a fever, or thinks she's got a fever, we'll see what's going on. But no, bang, it's Ebola.
Yeah.
This was on a 6 p.m. bulletin, was it, on the news?
It's been on every day.
It was rotating as the top story. Thursday afternoon, Friday morning, it was just rotating. We returned to our top story because there's news every half an hour in this country on every network. 4:30 news. Join us for the 5 o'clock news when then we'll be back at 6 o'clock for the news. Then 7 o'clock is the project. It's news, but news done differently. And but it was just a recurring thing. Ebola.
So this is actually their lead story.
And my friend who I was with at the time, we did a little experiment, and we said we're going to change between every channel, and it's going to be the same thing. And we changed to Channel 10. Ebola Scare, lady in Queensland. And then we changed to Channel 9. Our top story, Ebola. And they were pretty much reading off the same script. It was unbelievable. But they were making it even more exaggerated because they had no footage of the lady or any information. They were just showing recurring footage of people in these, African countries going through, from like 10, 20 years ago, just people, going through bushes, and then they're showing, these poor African, people, and then they were showing United States footage of people in their gas masks and everything, just saying. And it said, lady shows symptoms of low fever. It could be Ebola. And I was just going, this is absolutely unbelievable. So you're lucky you missed out on it, Johnno, because it was an absolute bombardment. And it went on for most of Thursday and Friday. It's just unbelievable.
Can I come in with, I was looking at the Jim Stone freelance site, and he had a CNN video that had been pulled, and it had a young kid about 12, and he walks in. This is in Africa, and he walks in, looking around, bouncing along, and then suddenly just lies on the ground. Oh, he's got Ebola. It was so farcical, and obviously that's why they pulled it. You know, I'd be guffawing. It's almost like me when I looked at them cutting their throats on the. ISIS cutting their throat, you know, you just fall about laughing. It's so bloody ridiculous, you know. But anyway,
there was that segment, I think it was ABC News from like a week ago, of a guy supposedly in West Africa watching as a hazmat crew were cleaning up a dead body, and it's like, oh, you know, this 31-year-old man, no one came to help him, and now he's dead. There's like hundreds of people, like, you know, 50 feet away, all blocked off, the whole thing clearly staged, and then what happens? Hold on, he's not dead. He's moving his finger. He's not dead. Like, they're pushing this meme of, you know, zombie virus, like people coming back to life and playing into, I guess, fears that have been put into people's minds from all of the mainstream films, like Outbreak or Contagion or 28 Days Later. All of these films that, you know, push this idea of viruses that don't just kill you, but change your behavior or maybe even help you come back to life or be like the undead. I think there might well be an agenda here to tip into that fear.
Well, one of the most popular shows on TV right now is The Walking Dead, where the virus spread throughout humanity, and now most of the people are, you know, walking dead. They're not zombies. They're people that caught this virus and now they, you know, live. But everyone's infected in the show, and once a person dies, they then rise as one of these dead, and it's. You know what I mean? It's eerily familiar to, you know, what's the narrative that they're trying to push subliminally in parts about, you know, this Ebola virus. And I just think it's just ironic how throughout all of media, through pushing through wars, through pushing, you know, movies about wars, movies about aliens, movies about, you know, all of these things, that we're being programmed to somehow believe this. So when they come out and say that they're going to start rounding up people say, well, we saw it in the movies, you know what I mean? You know, we don't want that to happen, like what happened in the movies. And it's, you know, programming us to believe things a certain way, just as, you know, it has all throughout history. That's what that's what film is for. That's what television is for. That's what the news is for every night. It's unbelievable.
Well, I can remember about 10 years ago, maybe a bit more than that, I noticed that there were articles in the paper about we're going to have to eat our dead. Do you ever recall any of this?
No.
No. I'm not exaggerating. And it wasn't once. It come up 2, 3, 4 times. You see it in different publications. And I thought, what's going on here? There's something's not right here. And then that's drifted away. And I'm just wondering whether that was the start of this lunacy about.
Yeah, well, who knows?
Zombies
as I said, it's hard to get through the deception. It's hard to piece together things when you're being told a certain way, and that's interesting.
Yeah. No, it was really odd. It was. I can remember it because I was heightened. What's going on here? Why would they suddenly have 3 or 4 stories on this? Obviously, nobody's going to buy into this, but they were pushing it, and then it's gone by the way now. So I don't know what the background.
Well, a perfect example of true history is when they broadcast the War of the Worlds broadcast. And, you know, people believed it was a real alien invasion. And then, there was people in their cars trying to flee cities, and they used, you know, it served as the perfect pretext to understand how people can react to this. Yeah. And then, you know what I mean? And things like that are being drilled into the subconscious of the people.
Yeah, I like those stories, like those historical examples of where people have been manipulated into frenzy or fear. You mentioned the War of the Worlds back when people used to listen to radio shows and they believed that one was real. Just today I was reading an independent article about possible conscription here in Australia. And of course it was about 50 years ago, almost to the month, where conscription was brought in for Vietnam, and they showed archival footage from ABC of people on the streets, like, you know, interviewers on the street asking people, do you think we should be going into Vietnam? Now, I'm sure even 50 years ago, just like today, they edit out all the people who say no and just show the people who say yes to help manipulate the people, because we're herd animals. If you're sitting there at home and you're watching the news and they ask everyone, do you support the war we're going to? The average sheep, if you see 5 people on the TV go, yep, I support it, you're more likely to go, yeah, I support it too. So they intentionally filter out the people who don't agree. What was interesting was the justification given by these people back in Australia, back in 1964, for supporting sending people to Vietnam. And sure enough, they're talking about the communists. And for us today, it's such a ridiculous notion. But with any luck, if there are still intelligent people who are allowed to read books in 50 years, they'll look back and say, you want to go into Iraq to bomb people because of ISIS beheadings? But yes, that's what people want because they've been programmed that way.
Yeah.
Why do you think they call them television programs? It's an in-joke.
Yeah.
They are programming us.
Yeah.
And how do they do that? With broadcasts. Think about this word. It's a broadcast. They're just catching you with like fish. It's that easy for them. They're broadcasting programs. They're telling you what you're doing.
Yes.
But you click the little remote at 6 o'clock and you'd say, hey, tell me what to think.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Now, one other thing that I saw during the week, and I don't know how much truth in it, but they were saying that the states in Africa that are having the Ebola outbreaks are also the states that have been doing negotiations with China. And the person writing the article was concerned that this is a warning to them to back off away from China because you're interfering with America's interests or whatever. Now, I don't know how much truth in that, but there's just so many things in play, and that's what I've noticed over the years, that these people never do one thing. They usually do 2 or 3 things in the one, whatever action they take. It has 2 or 3 outcomes. They're very good, like very good chess players. Really.
Well, speaking on that, we spoke last week about people the toppling of countries that were trying to create a gold standard, and and obviously we spoke about China and Russia's sort of unofficial partnership that they have, and how they would support some of these countries like Iran and Syria if they were under attack because of negotiations. And I think that is a good segue into our next point about the gold standard that was being created, and how countries that are trying to band together or try to negotiate that go against the status quo of the Western world and of this. I think it's a good segue to start talking about some information and new developments that you found with the gold and silver markets.
Yeah.
Would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, I will. First of all, I'm not a gold expert or a silver expert. I've just got an interest in it. But during the week, I came up with this news story about a Swiss referendum. Now, apparently in Switzerland, if the parliament won't pass what the Swiss people want, the Swiss people can collect 100,000 signatures, and that then forces a referendum on the issue. Now, from what I can gather, they've decided they want a referendum on the Reserve Bank in Switzerland maintaining 20% of their assets in gold bullion. Now, this is for the 31st of November. So my ears pricked up because I thought this is really very interesting, because from all the stuff that I've read, there is no gold about. China's sucking it up like a sponge. India's sucking it up. Russia's sucking it up, and they never release any of theirs onto the market. So if this was the case, then Switzerland would have to go out for the next 3 years or so and pull in 500 tonne a year. Now it's just not there. So that's almost precipitating some sort of a collapse in the gold market if it happens. Now, at the same time, I was listening to a fellow called Harvey Organ, and he puts out a newsletter on who's got the gold and the silver and who's taken it out of depositories and who's put it in. So he was saying that China uses 2 million ounces of gold per month in their pharmaceuticals, televisions, telephones, computers, and solar panels. Because solar panels are important because there's a massive build towards solar energy in China over the next 50 years. He's saying that they're using that much and they've only got about 3 million ounces in stock. So he was saying by the end of November, there's going to be a crunch coming for silver. And that's when the price could take off. Now, I'm not suggesting it is going to take off, but I just found both of these 2 bits of news for the end of November to be quite interesting. Now, his proposition was that the Chinese have got probably 3 billion at least US dollars. They've got plenty of money they want to get rid of. They want to get rid of the fiat rubbish, and they want to go into something solid like silver and gold. And this would be a perfect example for them to flood the market. So it's not just about gold and silver. It's also gold and silver and what it's going to do to the US dollar. Now, you've already got Saudi Arabia and China doing deals over oil. You've got Russia and China. You've got the BRICS, everybody, South Africa, Brazil, they're all working out exchange rates, exchange currencies outside the US dollar or the petrodollar. I just find it really interesting that there could well be something on by the end of the year. Now, if that flowed through, I'm looking at hyperinflation in the US. If they start sending $3 trillion worth of their currency back to the US, things are just going to explode. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that. There's no anything definite. The Swiss might not even vote the referendum in, but it just seemed interesting that you had both these things coming together almost at the same time.
Yeah, no, I think it's important that you raise that, and I think it's very ironic how it's towards the end of November and towards the end of the year, just after the G20 summit and after a lot of these, we discussed about the dangers that G20 poses to unrolling a police state, and some of the countries that you just talked about that are doing this, how they're ironically now being targeted, whether it's through the MH17 incident or whether it's through, countries in the Middle East that are being targeted that tried to create a gold standard and everything. And I think I've done a lot of research into the benefits of investing in silver, and I do think that soon or eventually it's going to, it's the thing to invest. And you raised a good point, because it creates the US. It creates a problem for the US because they don't have the gold to back the currency. Yeah. And I've read reports that most of the gold that they do have is just tungsten that's been painted gold. You know what I mean? To justify the actual backing of the dollar. So that's why any country that tries to create a gold standard or tries to not trade oil in US dollars or anything suddenly becomes a target. And I think it's very interesting that you raise that point. What do you think, Johnno?
Well, I don't follow the gold and silver markets as close as some people, but zerohedge.com, which is a terrific alternative news source, they focus on gold and silver a lot. And my memory is that a few months ago, maybe early in the year, maybe later last year, Germany wanted a certain amount of its gold back from the US Federal Reserve or one of their subsidiary Fort Knox type gold installations, and they demanded it back, and they were originally told it would take so many months or years to get back a certain amount. Even that delivery never took place, and then just a couple of months ago, from memory, Germany released a public statement saying that actually we don't really even want our gold back anymore. We think it's safe in American hands, which seems like not so subtle way of saying, okay, we're not getting the gold back. A game over. Now, where is the gold? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. And from memory, even the US Congress can't actually perform an audit on the alleged amount of gold that it's supposed to have. So
no, they can't. No.
It's like everything. If you don't hold it, you don't own it. And look, as far as investing in gold goes, I know a lot of people, in the prepping community or in the alternative news community like to prepare for when the system finally collapses, which it inevitably will. Yeah. History and mathematics both tell us this. I'm not personally convinced that gold is a safe bet for two reasons. One, what happened in the 1930s in America? It was confiscated. And it's amazing to me how few people know this. Yes, once upon a time, American citizens had gold and they were told, you have to hand it in. And if you don't, well, you're a criminal. There's nothing to stop that happening again. Those of you who can hold on to your gold and not hand it in, it's not exactly the most... I mean, you can't trade it for food very easily, can you?
No.
So, look, I don't know if it's... I would never try and advise anyone to hedge into gold or to silver, but in terms of the greater market for gold, in terms of the geopolitical ramifications, I think I agree with you guys. Over the next few months and maybe years, we're going to see this become a bigger and bigger issue.
Yeah, well, the system's inevitably bound to collapse, as you've said, Johnno, and that's why they're pushing the end game at the moment with all of these wars and with, all of these erosions of freedom so we can start to get together. Interesting about, gold and silver. Yes, the Federal Reserve, when they're questioned before Congress, can say, Congress can't perform audits on it. But it's interesting, and I also can't envision a world where the economy collapses and then that would be a viable thing, because that would assume that it would be a world where we're all trying to work together if that happened. And we all know that if the economy collapsed, most people are conditioned to believe that money is the be-all, end-all, and, either anarchy would ensue or whatnot. But the government design, the powers that be, designed this system. It's been designed to collapse, and this is what they want. And the only way that gold and silver, in my estimation, would work in a world is if these powers were out of the way. The economy just can't collapse, and then everyone starts trading in silver and gold, and we all build a new society through that way, because once the economy collapses, it gives them the pretext to start doing all of these things and to start doing the things that they've planned for. But perhaps maybe in a perfect world where we're all working together for once, world peace, the big question that's so simple but so hard to comprehend, I think maybe it would be. But there's a lot of ideologies out there, but I do think it's interesting in the global scheme of things with the fake debt US money that's being used to perpetrate oil. I think, it's very interesting.
I think the joke is once again on us. At least in Germany, when their currency became useless, they could at least burn it for heat. Our currency is plastic. What are we going to do with it?
Well, Zimbabwe as well. They plastered the inside of their houses with it because it was cheap paper. Yeah.
What are we going to do with ours?
But that when you're talking about that, I think it'll be forced onto us, because that's what happened in Zimbabwe. You couldn't use it to buy food. You had to go out into the rivers and pan for gold.
Yeah.
And that's the only way. Little bits of, and they were saying the elderly just can't physically get out in the sun and do that. And how are they going to starve?
And the problem is the world's so large now, and the population's so large, it's not feasible that you could trade through those things. You know what I mean? We've talked about, there's no gold. You know what I mean? There's trillions, quadrillions in derivatives, you know what I mean, of this supposed debt system that we've done, and hardly any gold to back it up, you know what I mean? A small percentage. So how are 7 billion people going to live under a system where we can, trade these things? But I think that's a discussion for another day. But I think it's interesting you did raise that point.
One more point I will make on this is that this is very relevant to Australia for two reasons. One, because we're so highly urbanised. At least in some communities where people have some land or there are farms near about. Because really, when there's a collapse, everyone still needs food, right? Because Australia is so highly urbanised, the vast majority of us couldn't, even if we wanted to, even if we knew how to, grow our own food. We're entirely dependent on the state existing. That's the first reason why this is so relevant to Australia. The second reason is that the vast majority of people in Australia have no idea how highly leveraged our banks are. Our banks right now in Australia, roughly 2/3 of their lending is into real estate. Roughly 2/3, and that compares to the OECD, where it's roughly 1/3. That is to say that if our house prices ever were to suddenly drop, our banks would be technically insolvent very, very quickly, because A, they're so highly leveraged, and B, so much of their assets is the real estate that if the prices go down, look, their assets are going down, and once your assets are worth less than your liabilities, you're insolvent. So the idea that we're told here in Australia, where our banks are highly capitalised and we've got good regulations and all of this nonsense. It's all completely untrue, and you can find this out for yourself if you just do the research. We are every bit as much at risk of financial collapse, which would precipitate economic collapse. We are every bit as much at risk of financial collapse as they are in the United States, as they are in Britain and elsewhere. So these discussions, they're not just abstract. This is very relevant to us here in Australia.
Well, our Reserve Bank governor came out the other day and was saying that we're getting to a real estate bubble, and he was very rarely ever hear them voice that sort of thing. No, he was worried about a collapse.
Well, the 2008's the perfect example of it, how the bubble caused, a massive collapse, and then they just restart the same thing again, where it's made to go up to a bubble again and collapse. It's just a complete game. It's been designed like this.
And this is where the low interest rates and running the printing presses so hot in the US affects us. I'll tell you why. Because they do that there, and what does China do? China wants to keep its currency low, so they run their printing presses. So they've got all this hot money, and where does a lot of it go? Well, to places like Australian real estate. Now, if you're a manager at a bank in a certain level, or if you're working a certain aspect of finance, or you work in development or real estate, hey, what do you care that this is hot money? You're making big money, and this could last for years. This is a nice little gravy train. But what about for the rest of Australia? There's no benefit to us that in the last 6 or 7 years, Melbourne and Sydney property has risen 50% in real terms. There's no benefit to the average Australian for that. But the people who do benefit are going to keep that gravy train growing until it pops. And when it does pop, do you think they're sitting here to face the music? No, they've got their money. They've probably got property in Bermuda or God knows where. They're out of here. And you, me, and the rest of us, the other 24 million Australians, are going, what do we do now? But hey, we don't want to focus. We've got only 90 minutes in these shows. We need to move on to other issues. Any final points on that topic before we move on?
No, I think you summed it up right there, Johnno.
Well, I was hoping we could spend a few minutes now discussing these China-Hong Kong protests, which we did touch on briefly last week. Now, I just want to give a background on this topic before we get into the discussion. Obviously, in 1997, Hong Kong was formally handed over to China from British rule. And their chief executive, which is like the head of government, is named Lung Chunying. And the protests against him started to get big in late September to do with some laws that were passed regarding their polls in 2017 and who was allowed to nominate and all the rest of it. Now, last month, Wenwei Po, which is a Hong Kong-based pro-Chinese newspaper, reported that Joshua Wong was receiving financial support from the US. Now, who's Joshua Wong? He's that 17-year-old kid who supposedly is leading these protests against the Hong Kong government. And as many of our listeners will know, there were thousands of peaceful protesters out on the street in Hong Kong, and while that did die down about midweek, they've started to come back again. And I'll explain in the next couple of minutes why this is so relevant to Australia. On Friday, the People's Daily in China, which is like their main state-based newspaper, made similar accusations against Joshua Wong. And I want to give you a quote. This is a long one, so please bear with me, listeners. I want to give you a quote from The Australian, which is our basically state-based propaganda arm, from today. And this was reprinted from the Sunday Times, which is another Murdoch newspaper over in England. I'll just read out what this Australian newspaper, our only national broadsheet, had to say about all of this today. Quote, "The Chinese Communist Party's flagship newspaper launched a front-page attack against foreign interference in Hong Kong on Saturday as pressure grew on the former British colony's leader, and peaceful pro-democracy crowds surged back onto the streets. The editorial in the People's Daily came as Lung Chunying, the territory's Beijing-appointed chief executive, headed to China for talks with party officials, leaving behind a growing scandal over his private financial dealings. Mr. Lung is under pressure to explain his tax and regulatory arrangements with the Australian engineering company UGL, which has paid him more than $7 million in fees under a pre-existing contract while he has been in office. British regulators will be asked to join their Hong Kong and Australian counterparts in investigating Lung's conduct under the Companies Act," said Kenneth Lung, a parliamentarian. Public ire towards the chief executive has intensified after the discovery that UGL, an Australian company, has a $448 million contract with Hong Kong's MTR Corporation, which is majority owned by the government, to maintain 120 metro trains. Mr. Lung and UGL both deny any wrongdoing. This is the final part. The fact that his woes stem from a well-timed leak to an Australian newspaper has fanned the flames of conspiracy theorists who see the hand of the West in what is, by all available evidence, a grassroots mass movement of people angry about China's attempts to control elections set for 2017. End quote.
Unbelievable.
That what I just read out to you, and thanks for your patience, listeners, for listening to that. That is all verbatim from The Australian, which is our only broadsheet newspaper in this country left. It's our only national newspaper, owned, of course, by Uncle Rupert over in America. And they reprinted the exact same article in the Sunday Times, another Murdoch newspaper. Now, I probably will spend a whole show picking this nonsense apart. But let's focus on the important parts here. This is an Australian company who is being used as a way to get to this, essentially the head of their government. So this directly affects us here in Australia. It was an Australian newspaper who got these leaks. Where did they get those leaks? I mean, come on, this is obvious. And what did they do? They say that, and last week I said this was a US State Department operation, which is clearly the truth. What are they saying now? Conspiracy theorists who see the hand of the West in what is, by all available evidence, a grassroots mass movement. Now, some of our listeners who haven't followed this as closely as me might be wondering, well, how do you know this is a US State Department operation? Well, it always is. That's the whole idea. And we discussed last week how the US geostrategic goals in China is to always keep it fighting amongst itself to stay as one state. Keep the Chinese Communist Party busy maintaining one state, makes it harder for them to exert their sphere of influence elsewhere. The National Endowment for Democracy is a US non-profit soft power organization founded in 1983 to supposedly promote democracy. It is funded primarily through an annual allocation from US Congress within the budget of USAID, the US Agency for Development Assistance, which is part of the US State Department. What does all this mean? So the US State Department funds USAID, who fund the National Endowment for Democracy, to give money to people like Joshua Wong, this 17-year-old kid, give him training in how to foment an uprising against his own government as a means to further the US State Department agenda. I don't expect anyone to take my word for it, though. Let's listen to a guy called Alan Weinstein, who helped draft the legislation which led to what we now call the National Endowment for Democracy. Before he created the endowment, he was a professor at Brown and Georgetown universities. He served on the Washington Post editorial staff, which should tell you all you need to know about his links. And he was the executive editor of the Washington Quarterly's periodical. And he dealt with people like Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, people who I know you're a big fan of, Lindsay. Now, he stated in this Alan Weinstein, he stated in a 1991 interview, a lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. And he was quoted by the historian William Bloom in saying that in his book Rogue State 2000. So they don't even have to hide this. This is clearly what they do. They're clearly doing it again. But what is our propaganda arm in Australia telling us? What are they telling them in Britain, thanks to Uncle Rupert? No. If you think this has anything to do with America, who openly admit that they do this kind of stuff all the time, if you question how a 17-year-old could be fomenting protests against his own government, you're a conspiracy theorist.
Yes.
And of course, what did we learn last week in our show about conspiracy theorists? David Cameron's coming for us, isn't he? Because if you are a conspiracy theorist, you're a preacher of hate, you're an extremist, an ideological extremist. We're not far away from them saying, hey, Johnno, you know how you accused the US State Department of being involved in this protest? Well, you're just as dangerous as those Muslim extremists, and we've got a little place for you. So that is why, those are just some of the reasons why what's happening in Hong Kong and China right now are so important as to here today, and that's why I wanted to spend some time talking about it. Boys, what do you think of this?
Yeah, well, don't laugh about it. They might be coming for you. Well, especially after you've been doing this. Yeah. Bloody hell.
I'm still baffled by the Australian article that said that, because it's blatant proof there. I mean, all the evidence already suggests, as Johnno just ran through, and I think he did a fantastic point going through all of that. I think the evidence already suggested towards that, because we said, how could we, you know what I mean, if a 17-year-old that we knew tried to revolt against the Australian government, or we got a group of 120 people or so and tried to build it within the streets of Brisbane, we'd be thrown in jail, we'd be tasered, dragged in their face, you know what I mean?
It's even better than that. What happened with Occupy Wall Street in the US? Declassified FBI documents were released which showed that they were strategizing about if they couldn't use the media to end this, revolt against the government, they would just assassinate the leaders of Occupy Wall Street. So this 17-year-old kid, if he was leading a revolt against the government here in Brisbane, what would be happening? Well, the US State Department and other secret establishment organizations will be plotting to kill him. But when he does it in Hong Kong, well, he's a peaceful protester leading a grassroots movement. And if you say otherwise, you're a conspiracy. I mean, it's so ridiculous.
No, it's unbelievable. It's blatant. And any time the media tells me to think some way, I automatically think the other way until evidence suggests, just from what I've known through the media, and obviously being involved in media in Brisbane here myself, you know what I mean? We're trained to actually how to manipulate and enforce fear to manipulate public opinion. You actually learn how to do that. The more fear that you can induce to get readers, the more rewarded you get by Uncle Rudolph's, newspapers. And I just think that was just, I'm still baffled by it, because, you want to speak out against this, you're a conspiracy theorist who is, now conspiracy theorists are also with ISIS. And we went through, the second legislative piece. Now they're going to start preemptively detaining people that think this way. They're going to do this. It's an attack on our freedom of speech. And we touched on that these people that are gathering in Hong Kong, they're protesting for freedoms that not even we have, because we couldn't be able to do that. So it's just unbelievable. What do you think, Lindsay?
Yeah. Well, when you're talking about Cameron, I sent an email with that quote, what have you, to my eldest daughter, and she's always been a bit worried about me. But she said, I can't believe that a world leader would come out and say that about 9/11 and just come out in the open about it. She just couldn't believe that they do it. Normally they, you're all conspiracy theory, we won't even mention this. But for him to come out like that, they must be getting a bit desperate.
Yeah, and it's just unbelievable, and it's blatantly. But in some positive news, speaking on people that have come out to speak out against things, I think we should move on to the final topic that we want to talk about today, which is Udo Ulfkotte and his comments on Russia Today. this week. I think Johnno can give a background on that because
Yeah,
it's very interesting.
I think his interview was a couple of weeks ago, but only came to my attention in the last few days. And what we'll do is we'll, just like all of our information today, we'll link to it in the info box underneath the video on YouTube. Check it out for yourself. It's a fascinating interview. This Dr. Udo Ulfkotte, who is a professor in communications or something like this, who was a journalist for 20 years in a major German newspaper. And on this interview on RT.com, in the space of 10 or 15 minutes, he basically laid out exactly how he and many people who he knew in the industry were CIA assets. And it's not like, you're just a normal dude, a normal journalist. They turn up, they tap you on the shoulder, and now you're they're more subtle. They're generally more subtle than that. They'll say, hey, we'll give you this story if you want to print it, if you want to come on this junket to this country, whatever. He stated openly, I was writing articles that I didn't believe in. They were being published by other people as well. I was doing it because I was a CIA asset. It happens all the time. And then he went on to say, it especially happens in Britain and also countries like Australia. The journalists there are puppets on the string of the CIA. And this, people like us and many of our viewers, listeners, they know this already. Or at least we ought to know this because it was revealed under Operation Mockingbird and the Church Committee back in the mid-70s. For those of our viewers who aren't familiar, the Operation Mockingbird was the US State Department and those sorts of organizations infiltrating the media to disseminate propaganda, which was against the law at the time. That's no longer against the law, by the way. They're allowed to do that now legally. Back then they weren't. They got caught doing it, and in the mid-1970s they had the Church Committee inquiry into this. And the then head of the CIA said, look, you caught us. We have been manipulating the media for 20 years. we promise we won't do it again. Who was the head of the CIA back in the mid-70s? George Herbert Walker Bush. Yeah, before he became the president of the US, he was the head of the CIA. Of course, he then became the president. His son was the president. And one of his other sons, Jeb Bush, just happens to be a leading candidate for the Republican Party for the 2016 election. Now, when you look at all of that, and when you read the propaganda that's being printed in our newspapers by people like Uncle Rupert over in America, and then you compare that to what's reported in the Chinese media, and you think, oh, look, I'm sure the Chinese are also spreading propaganda. But surely we're at the point now where we are more corrupt, we have more... look, if we're not more corrupt than them, if our system isn't more bullshit than theirs, it has to be a very level-run thing, because this is just ridiculous. And when people like Dr. Udo Ulfkotte come out and admit this, they're taking a huge risk, or at least you would think so. So the reporter asked him, hey, what about your safety by doing this? And like for our viewers who will go and check this out for themselves, he said, look, I don't have any children. I've had 4 heart attacks. I'm not so worried about me. And he has released a book. I'm not sure if it's been translated to English yet, but I can't wait to get my hands on a copy because it's someone who knows what he's talking about and who is respectable, saying what many of us have known for a long time. What do you think, Lindsay?
Yeah. That speaks for itself. The point that I was interested in was when you were saying about how we say, oh, it won't happen here, or it happens over there. It just reminded me of people on the take. We used to this is 20, 30 years ago, we used to always be going on about, Asians corrupt or whatever, South America's corrupt. And then it started coming out in Australia that most of our politicians were far more corrupt than any of them.
Yeah.
And I think you'll find it's the same thing with this, They point the finger they love pointing the finger at somebody else, but when you actually come into it, this place is rotten. And I dare say America would be rotten, Britain would be rotten.
Yeah, well, it's all throughout history. As you mentioned, it was revealed that Bob Carr was giving secrets from the Australian Labor Party back to, the CIA. He was doing that for 30 years or so, you know what I mean? And it's unbelievable. And I've got no doubt that on a positive note, there are some good journalists still in Australia, and that's what I try to highlight on my website. It's called the Spotlight section. I'm going to take it to a video where we do reveal the good journalists and we do bring articles that are exposing things and are questioning the system. The fundamental role of a journalist that have been buried behind, Kim Kardashian's, latest photos at the beach and whatnot. We do try to bring that forward. So I do, without a doubt, already know that at the highest levels within the journalism industry, it's completely controlled opposition, to feed propaganda to the people. But I do believe there are still some good journalists in Australia that are trying to do their job properly and actually spread it. But that's where we have to build an alternative network, and that's what we're doing. Just shows like this are so revolutionary towards the system because, you know what I mean? We're in a world with preconceived notions to tell us that this is the way that we think. And I think people like Udo Ulfkotte would probably be, you know, he probably supports alternative media and he'd probably be proud that people are starting to come out because of all the things that he knows. And I'm happy that he's come out to reveal this stuff. And I also can't wait to get a hand on his book, Johnno.
Yeah, I mean, we could sit here. You follow the Australian media, you know, especially the print media and the Murdoch media pretty closely, as do I. You and I could sit here and reel off names of people we're very confident are CIA assets. I mean, it's obvious. Now, we won't do that. There's no point to start naming names like that at the moment. Hopefully, we don't get as independent journalists or as independent reporters on these things. We're just people giving our opinions and broadcasting it so well people want to listen. Hopefully, we can do this at least up until G20 because, as we discussed in the last episode, that's where we see the independent media being so important. So few people in this city know what happened in Toronto 4 years ago. They've got no idea what's coming to this city. Yeah. And it's my hope that we can at least stay on the air for long enough so that when it comes to G20, we can provide people the truth about what's happening here because we can see it, we can report on it, and that's what people are going to need because they're not going to get the truth from the compromised mainstream media.
Yeah, no, and I just going to upload a video. I did an interview with Freedom Free for All TV over in Canada being broadcast over there, and we spoke about the similarities between the Toronto G20 and what's being rolled out here at the Brisbane G20. So anyone that wants to know about the Toronto G20, you know, head to TOTT News, the YouTube channel to, you know, to get up to date on that, or you can look at the documentary Into the Fire because the Brisbane G20 is going to be a mirror of that, and hopefully we can be the striving independent force in this country to try and get the word out about what's actually happening because as we've just said, and as Udo Ulfkotte just revealed, the mainstream media are not going to do it because they're all infiltrated and they're all completely controlled as is completely blatant. So I think anyone that wants to, you know, try and spread the word, I definitely encourage it because, you know, we've got to be a voice in a world of telling us of a preconceived world of reality where we've got to come out and say, hey, no, while we still have the chance because it's being eroded every day, Johnno.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, before we wrap this up, I think we could just touch briefly on our personal segment about what's been happening with all of us during the week. I think, Johnno, you've been up to some things planning your YouTube channel and
as you know, I've been working on a video for my YouTube channel about this Newman Hater incident that occurred down in southeast Melbourne a few weeks ago. Obviously in Australia there's not many independent YouTubers or reporters. We've got PK doing some awesome work down in Melbourne, but other than him there's not really much being done. So keep an eye out on AustralianRoundtable.com, and once I've got my channel uploaded and that video uploaded, I'll link to it there. And I'm looking forward to really spending some good time over the next week or two getting some videos up because Lord knows Australia needs it right now.
Yeah.
What have you been up to, Lindsay?
Oh, I've got an elderly mother I look after, so that takes up a lot of my time. But in between that, I've got inspiration from you fellas because you've given me sites and things that I'd never even heard of before. And I've been just spending a lot of time on that, probably getting into trouble. You know, come to dinner. But anyway, that's all right. But no, it's good. It's good. It sort of broadened my horizons. I've got a garden too, and I'm really concerned that just looking at what's happening to prices in America, food prices, whatever, I think it's going to hit here soon. I think I've got to concentrate on getting a garden going so that at least we've got a bit of tucker if nothing else. Sorry. Tucker's food, yeah.
Australian slang for some of our international listeners out there.
Yeah, so at least you've got something to live on if things do go bad. I'm too old to get a job now, and it's just the way things are going. But it's been really quite interesting for me to start going through these other websites and seeing things. Like I've got a massive library that I've been through over the years and whatever. But it's the things that are happening now. It's very enlightening for me and I appreciate being in your company.
No.
I think you've been a terrific addition to the program. Hopefully you'll be a regular panelist.
Well, we'll see how we go. I'd hope to be, but it'll just depend on, my other commitments and whatever. But I'd like to be.
Excellent.
Yep. And me, just a quick thing before we wrap up the show. I'm obviously always out at protests and always out at rallies and whatnot, and yesterday was the Muslim and non-Muslim Solidarity March. to show that we won't be divided and we understand who the real enemy is, and this propaganda of fear and deception to divide us amongst each other, to paint every Muslim as a terrorist, isn't working. And it was very uplifting to be out there and to see Indigenous elders there speaking about how they support the Muslim community and how everyone has the right to practice their religion, and how the people won't be divided. And I got to take the role of being at the front of the march, screaming the chants that the people united won't be divided. So that's what I've been up to, trying to get past some of the deception and fear propaganda of the mainstream media, and that's what we're trying to do with this show. So we hope that you can join us each week. We will be live every Sunday from 4 p.m. We will link to this on social media, TOTT News social media, and around the Roundtable website that we're going to get up. So stay tuned for a lot more coming, and hopefully, we can continue, as we said, to bring you the latest vital news and information. I'd like to thank both of you for being here today. Thank you, Lindsay, for coming in.
Thank you both.
Once again, thank you, Johnno. It's been great.
Thanks a lot, Ethan. Fantastic.
Thank you to all our listeners at home, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers, guys.